This is an example of what you need to think about and complete as you work on part 2 of the instructional design project for this class. And since part 2 of this class is dependent on what you accomplished in part 1, I'm going to present to you a little bit of information for my example here that relates to part 1. If you recall, one of the parameters on the instructional design project for this class is that you need to develop a learning experience for a target population in which, as part of the learning experience, you help them learn how to appreciate something more. And so it reminded me of something that I experienced just a couple of weeks ago. I was in Baltimore and I went to the Visionary Art Museum. And on the second floor of the museum, there was an installation by an artist named Matt Ciso. And he is an outsider artist, as are all the artists at the Visionary Art Museum. And I don't know that much about outsider art. I learned some as I was enjoying the work that is in the museum. But the work of this particular artist really spoke to me. I thought there was so much interesting movement and emotion in the works of art, and many of the pieces that that Matt has created include some common elements. Like you'll notice in this painting, there's of a whale. There's a little creature inside the whale, and there's also a big eye, a big spinning eye. It looks like a target or a spinning propeller or something. There's another one of the pieces that was on display, and you'll notice it also has some of those common elements. Lots of teeth. I don't know if that means aggression or if that communicates aggression, but lots of teeth and lots of disproportionately sized eyes with that same target or spinning thing. Again, lots of movement. And one of the things I learned that was really interesting after enjoying this art that, like I said, I just really, it really spoke to me, is I learned afterwards that the artist, and here's a picture of him, the artist Matt Ciso was in had a very traumatic event happen when he was an 11-year-old boy, and that is he was playing in a field near his home, and a small airplane had a landing, unexpected landing, I guess, in the field. I'm not sure if it was unexpected or if it was a landing strip. I don't know. But you know, kids will play anywhere, right? So this plane just dropped on top of this boy and cut one of his arms off, as you can see in this picture. Well, I didn't realize that, but knowing it as I looked at other pieces of his art, I discovered that there was a lot of movement, of the feeling of unpredictable movement, and certainly something I would imagine that was informed by his life experiences. And the reason why I talk about it is because another thing I learned about this artist is that he's an outsider. He didn't start painting until he was a young man. He already had started a career as a computer scientist for IBM, and he was at a party that somebody brought him to that had a lot of artists, and a young woman came up to him thinking he was an artist and asked him what kind of art he did, and he just said that he painted. And they made plans for her to come over to his apartment sometime after that. And so he went home and he thought he better start painting. If a young woman is coming over to see his work, he ought to have something. And I just love that story because here's a man who approached painting with no formal training whatsoever and almost no experience, and he started painting. And when you look at some of his works, they just have there's so much inside that I think he manages to get across very honestly in his work, and that kind of story fascinates me. And that's the kind of story that I would probably, that inspired me, and if I was an art teacher, I would probably want to use something like that story to help inspire others to appreciate outsider art. And so if I was doing this project, I think what I might want to do, if I did have a target population of art students, I might want to create a learning experience where the goal was that I wanted my students to appreciate outsider art. And so, of course, the big question, and this was from part one, is what does it mean to appreciate art? What does it mean to appreciate outsider art? So after brainstorming just sort of a list of possible things related to appreciating art and doing 5 minutes of research online, because I'm going to warn you right now, nothing you're about to see is the result of anybody who knows anything technically about art. I'm one of those people who does not know much about art. I just know what I like. And so with limited research, I set about trying to operationalize this statement. How do you appreciate outsider art? And so I considered that one way you might be able to, that might be indicative of an appreciation for outsider art, is that a person would be able to identify specific examples of outsider art and explain how each piece reflects elements of art brut, folk art, naive art, and or visionary art perspectives, and I guess perspectives and elements. So again, I just took one piece of appreciating art, and the way I was thinking about it was that if you can actually identify examples, then at least you've learned enough about it to be able to distinguish one type, perhaps distinguish one form of art from another. And I would imagine it would be really hard to be definitive about whether or not a piece is an outsider or not, if you aren't some kind of an expert. But this is just as an example. Now, I do want to point out, so let me go. Oops, I was going to go back, but I don't think my program here is going to let me. So I'll move forward. One of the things that I also did to my goal is something that you might not have done yet to your instructional goal, and you don't necessarily need to do it for part two of this project, but I wanted to do it now so that I could telescope or project where you're headed, where you're going to be headed with the continued revision of your goal. Once you develop a really good goal statement based on some of the feedback that I provided, then you'll go about the task of analyzing it and breaking it up into its subordinate steps. But one of the things that you're going to do, and that I did in this revised goal statement, is include some kind of a context. And in this case, the context represents something that reflects how the learner might apply those skills of appreciation in the real world in some way. And I guess you could take this in many different directions. I could have had actually creating a piece of outsider art, if that's possible, if you're not trained or whatever the criteria might be for that. But I chose a context that did add some kind of a realistic frame around that goal. And so my revised goal was to have the learners create a visual guide to outsider art for a local community that includes photographs of specific examples from the community, along with descriptions of specific ways in which each piece reflects those elements of those different types of outsider art. And one thing I really like about this is it sort of forces the learners to be able to go out, take the skills of identifying outsider art, and go out into their communities and actually identify some. And it could be graffiti, it could be other things like visionary environment pieces that might reflect sculptures or other things. But I would imagine in any community you could find some very good examples of folk art that exist in the community itself and not necessarily in a museum. So I thought this was a pretty good further revision of the goal statement. And so once you get your goal statement so that it is fairly clear, and again, I want to remind you that you don't necessarily have to include a context at this point. I just did it because it's coming eventually. But once you have a clear goal statement, then you need to analyze it to break it up into the steps that reflect what the learners will need to be able to learn how to do in order to successfully perform that goal. So I just brainstormed a listing. One is I thought that they should be able to compare and contrast those different perspectives of outsider art. Compare and contrast them. It's a pretty big goal. Or I mean, it's a pretty big goal step. I'm calling them goal steps. Or you could also call it an objective if you want. I also think that they should be able to distinguish outsider art from more traditional artistic perspectives. And again, if you're a subject matter expert in art, you'll have to excuse my wording. I don't know what I'm talking about, other than to say that I think distinguishing what makes something outsider from not outsider is important. And there may be something visual or physical about it that could be taught. I'm not sure, but I'm just pretending. I think that they should also be able to describe the basic elements of those following types of outsider art. You might think that's part of comparing and contrasting, but I think it is actually I think it needs to be learned separate from comparing and contrasting, because that's kind of an extension of this. I also think that classifying examples of outsider art, examples of outsider art examples, a little bit of redundancy going on there. Classify examples into one or more of the following categories. That's a separate skill, if you will. And again, you might not be wording all of yours like these outcomes or objectives that the way I have it. I just have been doing this for a while. My brain can't really think any differently. So your statements might be a little more broad than this, or a little more content related, or something. Of course, defining outsider art might be an important skill. And one more thing I wanted to add that would likely be beyond the scope of my project for the class, but because I want the learners to be able to capture photos of art in the community and then make a guide, or even a I could have changed it and had a make an exhibit even, but anyway, I would want them to take photographs. I'm going to demand that they do, and if they're going to do that, I would like the photographs to be as well composed as possible, given the limitations of whatever tools and whatever experiences the students have. So again, that is another thing that's definitely going to have to that I would expect out of somebody who is able to perform the goal well. Now, so once you do this, the next step in part 2 of the project is to organize these into some kind of order. Does one need to be learned before the other needs to be learned? And so I'm going to say absolutely in this case, and I went ahead and I ordered them, and I ordered them in something that I felt was fairly logical, where defining outsider art would be the very first skill to be learned. Distinguishing outsider art from traditional other artistic perspectives would be the next step, because if I'm going to use the term outsider art in that skill for number 2, then my students, I'm going to have to assume they know what it is. And then once they can distinguish it, they should be able to describe basic elements. And to be honest, number 3 might actually not be subordinate to number 2. I'm not sure. These words like subordinate and superordinate are used in the course text, by the way. So I might renumber number 3 and maybe have it be 2.2. I'm not sure, but I did think that the next learning outcome, comparing and contrasting, and the one after that, classifying examples, I don't think either. I think both of those are subordinate to 1, 2, and 3. Or I'm sorry, they're superordinate to 1, 2, and 3. That is, you have to learn 1, 2, and 3 first. But I'm not sure there's an order to 4-1 or 4-2. I'm not sure. And then number 5 actually doesn't even really belong with a number. Take well-composed photographs. That doesn't relate to 1, 2, or 3 in terms of you don't need to have to do any of those other ones in order to be able to do that one. So maybe I shouldn't have even numbered that one. But make a best guess at ordering your steps in a way that makes sense to you. And the last thing that I want you to do, because it's going to help you with part 3 of this, or parts 3 and 4, is to begin to draw some kind of a concept map for the information, the content that you know is going to sort of be part of the landscape of your educational environment. Most people are not that comfortable planning out learning experiences when they're developing developing a piece of instruction, but they tend to be more comfortable initially actually sort of defining what is all the content that's going to define the backdrop for learning these skills. And I did a really quick job on this, and I'll just tell you right now, it's I have my goal statement way up here. And you'll see that well-composed photos is separate from any content that might be in any other part of the presentation or of the experience. I might include instruction on well-composed photos, or I might include a learning scaffold that my learners could take advantage of if they needed it, if they didn't have experience taking well-composed photos. But I would say that in order to perform the goal, I would want them, first of all, they have to describe and identify examples of these 4 different types, and that includes comparing and contrasting, but that comes after I provide the content. So I have that, and then I am not sure how much traditional art characteristics I would need to communicate. It would depend on my students and probably some other factors. But I would know that from a real basic map of the content that a lot of the information I'm going to be developing for this program is going to surround identifying descriptions and examples of these 4 different types of outsider art, and in some way providing information that contrasts this with traditional. I also included visual versus non-visual because all the outsider art that I'm going to be talking about in my program is going to be visual art. It's not going to be something like music, for example, which is certainly an art form. And if you think about it, an awful lot of music is outsider art, isn't it? Even a group like the Beatles, for example, none of the Beatles had much formal music training, but they certainly were inspired by many and just practiced and had whatever magic exists when you have a group that good. But I know I'm going to have to do something with the visual as well, and so I want you to, in part 2, to actually develop some kind of a map, and I do include in the notes some information about some links to some resources about developing concept maps. That might be useful, as well as some tools you might use, online tools that are free if you wanted to have some support in actually creating a visual to help you with your content map. So that's it. That's the scope of part 2 of the instructional design.